Thank you for coming tonight. This is Dave Giannotti. Dave is the head of the Public Education and Training section for the State Ethics Commission. And we asked him to come out here. My own opinion about training like this is the more we know about this, the more we can follow the rules. And an incredibly important thing to me that I've learned in my 2 years as a town clerk is we have to follow all the rules so that the public has confidence that everything is done above board. It's as simple as that. And because of people's lack of knowledge or inattention to detail or plain mistakes, in a lot of cases there has been loss of confidence in our town government, and sometimes that's just misinformation. So it's incredibly important to have somebody like Dave come out here and try to explain to us in English what these rules are and how we can comply with them. And I thank you very much for coming out here tonight.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, we'll get started so that I don't keep you much more beyond the 4-hour length.
That's appreciated.
The conflict law is very complicated. There are 29 some odd sections of the law. Some of them are fairly intuitive, easy to understand. Others are a little bit more complicated. Now, how many of us serve on boards or committees in the town? And how many of us are appointed department employees with the town? Okay, so we have a few. People are being bashful, so those are the ones I'm going to call on now when I want to ask a question. I'm just kidding. But in any event, the conflict law applies a little bit differently if you're a board or committee member. Because you're serving part-time, generally you're unpaid, you may be considered what we call a special municipal employee for conflict of interest law purposes. So I might just diverge. So if you're a full-time employee of the town, just bear with us because we want to make sure that our volunteer members of our boards and committees have a grasp on the law. So as Jim said, my name is David Giannotti, and I'm the Chief of the Public Education and Communications Division of the State Ethics Commission, and we're going to talk about the conflict law. Now, a couple of ground rules. I'm not a lawyer. I don't give out legal advice, but we do have attorneys on staff at the Ethics Commission, and we get thousands of calls. So point number one, to start us off, if you encounter a conflict situation, or if you need information about how the conflict law might apply prospectively to something you're thinking about, please call our office. One of the main points of what we do when we come out and talk about the law is to drive calls to the Ethics Commission. As I indicated, some parts of the law are fairly confusing, and we want to make sure that to the extent you need advice, that we're there to provide you with the advice you need. And we just want to make sure we're the experts, and we would appreciate you calling us because we'll give you the right information. You know, am I allowed to do it? Do I have to file a disclosure? All of those complicated kinds of questions. Secondly, as I go through my presentation, you might have a question, and I encourage questions because it may help the information resonate with us here. But just remember that the Ethics Commission is here. We are a law enforcement agency, so if you do have a question, keep it prospective. Don't tell me that you violated the conflict of interest law, and I'll do my best to give you the information that you need. So let's start out talking about it, because I apologize, we got a little bit of a late start. I was up at Town Hall standing around for a little while wondering where Jim was, so luckily his assistant told me that everything was going on down here, so my apologies for that. But what is it? What is the whole point of the conflict law? As Jim alluded, integrity in government, confidence in the work that public employees do as they're performing their civic duties for state, county, or municipal government. Conflicts of interest undermine that confidence. The conflict of interest law seeks to preserve the level of integrity and confidence in government. What is a conflict of interest? Well, if you are a public employee, and you all are, even though you're unpaid, you're not a public employee for pay and benefits purposes, but thank you for your service. Even though you are a volunteer, you are a municipal employee for conflict of interest law purposes. Even though you're unpaid and you serve on a board and committee, you are required to comply with all of the provisions of the conflict of interest law. The law applies to you if you perform services for a state, county, or municipal agency. A conflict of interest is a situation where your public responsibilities and your private interests intersect. Our job, our mission, is to serve the public interest. Now, what is the public interest? Well, it's whatever the mission of your agency, your department, the town, your board, your committee. If you serve on the Conservation Commission, for example, your mission, the public interest, is effectively and fairly and impartially enforcing the provisions of the Wetlands Protection Act. If you serve on the Planning Board, it's to fairly and impartially enforce the provisions of the subdivision control law, so on and so forth. Conflicts of interest undermine that. The conflict of interest law seeks to preserve that by requiring certain things. If a conflict of interest occurs, if your public responsibilities and your private interests intersect, that's a conflict of interest. It doesn't mean it's a violation of the law, but it simply means that the law applies, and the question then becomes how. And conflicts basically break down two ways: financial interest conflicts and everything else. A financial interest conflict is a situation where you're poised to perform your public duties, your responsibilities, and you have a financial interest in that matter. Or a family member might have a financial interest in that matter. Can you appoint an immediate family member to a job with a public entity? No. Why? Because the conflict of interest law says, as to financial interest conflicts, you are disqualified from performing your duties if certain financial interests are affected. Yours, immediate family members, and we'll get into that in a little bit. And then non-financial interest conflicts incorporate everything else. A situation comes up, it's not going to affect your financial interest or a family member's financial interest. It could affect a friend, a neighbor, a former employer. Those situations create appearances of conflict of interest, where people looking at the circumstance will wonder whether you're going to perform your duties as required. Are you going to serve the public interest, or are you serving some other interest? In other words, the public interest is that needle on the compass pointing north, and a conflict of interest are situations where that needle might move, and people will wonder whose interests are being served. So, public responsibilities, that's the job. You understand that. Private interests. What is a private interest that might rise to the level of a conflict of interest? And the short answer is any component of your private life. Who you are, where you live, who your friends are, who your family members are, what outside business interests you might have, where you live, what church you might affiliate with, what nonprofits you might affiliate with. Any component of your life off the public job is potentially an outside interest for conflict law purposes. And whenever that occurs, that's when the red flag should go up. Financial interest conflicts, you have to stay out of those matters. The law disqualifies your participating in any matter that might affect certain financial interests. Unless, and the unless we'll get into in a little bit, if you're an appointed public employee, if the boss says it's okay, and you follow the procedures laid out in the conflict law, then you can participate in matters even though you might have a financial interest conflict on it. The point of the conflict law and disclosure, and I'm going to talk about disclosure in greater detail, is to create transparency. In other words, conflicts of interest, they happen. They happen every day in government. They may not ever happen to you, but they happen. And they're not to be feared, they're to be managed. And you manage them by getting out in front on those situations. How do you do that? Well, you disclose when it's appropriate. You put the cards on the table so that public employees who might think we're going to act on some bias that we might have, the disclosure dispels any appearance problem that's otherwise created, or we abstain from matters because some financial interest component might be involved. So that's basically it. Financial interest conflicts, everything else, public responsibilities, private interests. That's sort of the conflict of interest law in a nutshell. So we're done, right? I wish. But unfortunately, as I said, there are several sections that are very complicated, and I'll do my best to explain them. First up, let's talk about the Ethics Commission. The Ethics Commission is an independent state agency. We're a tiny state agency. We only have a staff of 23. We're always resource challenged at the agency, but the commission, the authority to enforce and administer the provisions of the conflict law rests with a state ethics commission. It's a 5-member board whose members are appointed by the governor, the secretary of state, and the attorney general. And I'm a member of the commission staff, the 23 staff people who are appointed either by the commission or by the executive director and conduct the day-to-day operations of the ethics commission. The job of the commission is to both administer and enforce the provisions of the conflict law. Administer means promulgate regulations, provide legal advice on how to comply with the law. Enforce means the Ethics Commission can prosecute violations. We're set up sort of like a military tribunal where we have an enforcement division of the Ethics Commission that investigates and prosecutes the most serious violations. We have a legal division which acts as the attorney for the commissioners, for the commission itself, and also gives out legal advice, the thousands of calls they take every year. And the enforcement division can prosecute significant violations before the full commission. A member of the commission that can conduct the hearing acts as a hearing officer, and then the full commission decides whether the law has been violated, and if so, what the appropriate remedy is. It's important that we understand the conflict law provisions because the commission can impose civil penalties of up to $10,000 for a significant violation of the law. That doesn't occur all that often, so I just want to reassure everyone that that's a very small part of what we do. But the commission can administer and enforce the provisions of the law, and anyone who performs services for government at the state, county, or municipal level, you're a public employee for conflict law purposes, and you're required to comply with all of these provisions. Now, this is sort of a refresher course because since 2009, the law requires that every public employee complete education on the conflict law. So the town gives you the summary of the law, you have to sign for it, and then you also have to complete the online training program. It presents the information in a fairly comprehensive way, and so why am I here? To sort of add a bit of dynamic, a little Q&A, a little FaceTime. If you have any questions, I can explain any confusing parts of the law. Okay, services provided by the Ethics Commission. If you have a question about what you need to do to comply with the conflict law, you can call the commission and talk to an attorney in our legal division to obtain advice. We also go out and do seminars when the budget allows us, but we get out as often as we can. If we're invited out, we'll come and talk about the conflict of interest law. And then if you believe someone has violated the conflict law, you can file a complaint with the Ethics Commission. And also, and so we have a website, it's off the state portal. If you have any question about the conflict of interest law, you can go on our website. We have a host of information. It's not a very deep site because we're required to operate in secret at the Ethics Commission. When the commission was formed and we began operations in 1979, strict confidentiality rules were imposed on the commission by statute. And what that means is we can't talk about most of what we do, but there's a certain amount of stuff that is public. When the commission issues a decision in an enforcement case, that becomes public. Everything leading up to that is required to be kept confidential. Anyone who calls our office seeking advice and what, if any, advice we provide, all required to be kept confidential. Except that when it's the Ethics Commission as opposed to one of our staff attorneys issuing advice, those are considered formal opinions because the commission will only do so when our attorneys are unsure about how to analyze the law in a given set of situation. If an issue is novel or complex and they're not sure how to give advice, the commission will issue the opinion. Those are considered precedents, so we are allowed to publish those on our website, but we redact the requester's information. Disclosure forms. I just talked about disclosure briefly, but there are several sections of the law and in connection with some regulations that I'll talk about where a disclosure of a conflict of interest is required to comply with the law. And so I'm going to use that term throughout the presentation. When I say disclosure, I just want to keep in mind it has a distinct meaning under the law. To comply with the conflict law, a disclosure has to be in writing. A written statement that contains all relevant facts that constitutes the conflict of interest. It has to be filed in a specific way. For appointed employees, we file it with our appointing authority, whoever is responsible for hiring us to our position. For elected officials, conflict law disclosures are filed with the town clerk's office. They have to be filed in a manner that is public in nature. So it has to be a written statement that contains all of the relevant facts. It has to be filed in a specific way. And they are public records. The whole point of disclosure is transparency. So we were sort of on the leading edge of the current trend of transparency in government. Transparency by public employees whenever they're performing their duties of conflicts of interest. Because whenever you have a bias, you have to disclose it. We are not allowed to to perform our duties with any hidden or undisclosed biases, where the perception could be that somebody is getting favorable treatment, even the perception. So just because you're performing your duties and some component of your private life might be affected, that triggers a conflict of interest. You can continue to perform your duties provided that you create transparency by filing the disclosure. And then we have links on our website to the mandatory, what we call the conflict of interest law education requirements. So you've all received the summary of the law. It's a brief description of the law. You have to sign for that, not to certify that you read it or that you agree to comply with the provisions, but simply as an acknowledgement that you received it, because the statute says the town has to give that to you, and that's how we verify that that occurred. And then the online training program is available, and that has to be completed once every 2 years. So if you obtain legal advice from the commission, as I mentioned, the advice is confidential. You can call, you can write, you can email. We have a fillable form on our website you can use, and don't be afraid to call us. We get over 6,000 calls. I think last fiscal year anyways, we get about 6,500 calls. We're on the speed dial of many legislators because they're constantly having to wrestle with issues because their legislators, guess what? They get invited to stuff. Can they get invited to the Chamber of Commerce breakfast or some awards banquet where a meal is going to be served? Because the gift restriction rules that apply to all of us are implicated in connection with those events, and so they frequently need to know how the law will apply to a given set of facts. So don't be afraid to call us. That's what I'm going to underscore throughout the presentation. We do not give out third-party advice because of confidentiality. In other words, we can talk to you about your situation, but we can't tell you what somebody else needs to do to comply with the law. Also, we don't give out past conduct. The whole point is getting out in front. Transparency, disclosing any potential biases. And that only works when you call us ahead of time. Our legal division can only give out prospective advice. If you engage in conduct which implicates the law, and then you want to call our office to find out whether it implicated the law in the worst way possible, our legal division can't help you. Then it falls within the purview of our enforcement division. And sometimes we'll get those calls where people acted first, thought twice about it afterwards, and then called us to figure out whether they had an issue. And our legal division says, sorry, we can't take the call. But our enforcement division will be very happy to talk to you about the issue. But our legal division will not refer any matters to our enforcement division. The whole point is we want people to call us. So if they learn of a potential issue under the law, they'll encourage the caller to report the matter to our enforcement division, but they will not report the matter to our enforcement division. Okay, so I talked about the education and training requirements already. But just for a quick review, when you take our online training program, that's one of the pages that you will see. So you know you're on the right program, and when you complete the program, there's a completion certificate that you need to fill out because we do not track completion information. We don't have a database that can hold that information because this program has to be completed by about 400,000 people, and an agency of 23 cannot hope to manage that kind of a database. So the only evidence that you can provide that you completed the program is to print that completion certificate or to save it as a PDF on your computer, or even snap a cell phone picture and keep it on your cell phone, and that will suffice as evidence that you completed the program. Just as a side note, we're working on issues right now. We were able to finally, after 5 years, engage a vendor to make improvements to the program because it doesn't work with Google Chrome. We tested against all the known browsers, and guess what? Google Chrome comes out after we launched our program, and it doesn't play nice with our program, so we get calls all the time from people saying, I just did your program, I typed in my name to appear in the certificate, and it doesn't show. And that's because Google Chrome has a pop-up blocker which keeps the information from transferring to the certificate. Now, we have got workarounds about that, but we send out information every year to the town saying, please share this information with your employees. One of them, don't use Google Chrome. Make sure to otherwise disable the pop-up blocker so that you won't have an issue printing that certificate. The summary of the law, it looks something like that. It has to be given to you every year. You have to sign for it. The last page of it is a tear sheet. You can fill that out. I have to keep the records for all of our elected state and county officials, and I just do it by email. Whatever electronic storage mechanism is available is best. So I've got all of our legislators' emails and so forth. I send them an email where I attach that summary, and I say, just reply to my email to tell me you got it, and that serves as the acknowledgement that they received it. But the written document will work as well. Okay, any questions before we get started? Let's talk about the conflict law. There are gift restriction rules, nepotism rules, code of conduct rules that we're going to talk about. These are the restrictions under the law that apply to us while we're on the job. And so let's talk about the gift restriction rules. Bribes. Public employees, cannot solicit or receive bribes. Bribes are what? They're corrupt acts. Why is it a conflict of interest? Because inherent in a bribe is something called a quid pro quo. Rather than the public employee serving the public interest, they're going to be engaging in conduct, making decisions which benefit the giver of the bribe, rather than serve the public interest. A quid pro quo. Example of a bribe, let's say I'm late to get here. It's not that I stopped at town hall at 6 o'clock and hung around for 25 minutes, but I was late and traffic was backed up. And I found my opening and I was tooling down the pike at a cool 90. Speed limit on the pike is 65 and I get stopped by the state police. What's the chances I'm going to get a speeding ticket? About 100%. And when I present my license and registration to the trooper, I also tuck a $100 bill into that mix. What's the point of that $100 bill? Say, thank you for stopping me, I was a little crazed out there, or you know what, you guys don't make enough, let me help you out, or quid pro quo, in exchange for this $100, I'd like to walk away from this unfortunate meeting without any additional paper in my pocket. In other words, a specific agreement that for that item of value, that $100, that trooper, where 10 out of 10 times they would write a speeding ticket, will not write the speeding ticket. In that scenario, both parties, me and the trooper, would violate the conflict of interest law. The potential civil penalty for this kind of a violation is $25,000, not $10,000. This is the most serious violation of the conflict law because it involves obvious corruption. Rather than the public employee performing their duties and serving the public interest, they're making decisions that benefit themselves. Okay, taking it down a notch, the conflict law also prohibits or restricts gifts that are worth $50 or more and given in connection with some official business dealings. Now, not bribes, there's no quid pro quo, but public employees cannot solicit or receive any item of value, no matter what it is, if it's worth $50 or more and given in connection with some official business dealings. In other words, the motivation for the giver is because there's some public business going on. The law applies to both parties in that sort of an exchange, both the public employee and somebody who offers or gives. And it doesn't have to be a consummated gift. The mere offering triggers a violation. Same thing with a bribe. You don't have to give the bribe. If you even offer a bribe, that's enough to violate the statute. But in a gift and gratuity situation, a gift worth $50 or more given for or because of some official act, while both parties can violate the conflict law, the potential civil penalty is $10,000. And then taking it down a notch further, section that was added to the law in 2009, and this is sort of the threshold gift restriction issue, so this is the one we all got to know. As public employees, we cannot solicit or receive anything that's worth $50 or more and given to us because of our official position. In other words, we don't even need to have any business dealings. If you know somebody just to say hello to them in town hall, and one day they come up to you and hand you some theater tickets or Red Sox tickets, and it's strictly because of who you are as a public employee, you cannot accept them. Any item worth $50 or more given because of official position is also restricted. But under this bottom bullet point here, only the public employee violates the conflict law, the giver does not. Go ahead.
Can you, Judy, you said you can't solicit gifts more than 50. Can you solicit $49?
Well, you can't as a public employee solicit anything. The language says solicit or receive. But if you solicit any item of value from someone, the people would raise a question as to what your motivation is. Are you serving the public interest, or are you using your position? Are you improperly using your position? And so while I say solicit or receive, that's the language of the statute. But
So really you can't solicit anything.
no, you really shouldn't. The whole point in day-to-day government is people want to do nice things for you. People may be motivated to leverage relationships. Because we work in government, what does that mean? Well, we're in a position of making decisions which affect people. We're in the business of saying yes or no matter what it is. It could be hiring, it could be procurement, it could be inspections, permitting, you name it. We're in the position of telling people yes and telling people no. The people we say yes to, they love us. The people we say no to, maybe not so much. They may be motivated to try to leverage those relationships to get what they want. Our job is to serve the public interest. Gift giving in the public sector undermines confidence in government, because people looking at those kinds of situations will wonder, is the public interest being served or some private interest being served? So the question then becomes, so I'm talking about, well, bribes of any value are prohibited. But under the bottom bullet points there, gifts worth $50 or more. The term substantial value is used in the statute, and that's been defined to mean anything worth $50 or more that is offered or given to a public employee. Now, what about gifts worth less than $50? The conflict law doesn't prohibit us from accepting a gift worth less than $50. What's an example? Well, somebody reimburses, we go to lunch with somebody that we have some business dealings with, and they offer to pay for the meal. Never a good idea, but if it's worth less than $50, it does not violate the conflict law unless there's a quid pro quo, which, who's going to bribe someone for less than $50? Well, hopefully nobody would accept that kind of a bribe. But in any event, if it's worth $50, it's not prohibited, but those are situations that create appearance problems. Because if somebody buys your lunch and you have dealings with them, or will have dealings with them, or had dealings with them, people looking at those circumstances will wonder whether you have been improperly influenced. In other words, is somebody going to get preferential treatment as a result? Let me give you an example to try to illustrate the point. Say I'm a school teacher. I'm a municipal employee, and the parents of one of my students have given me a $40 gift certificate to my favorite restaurant. Can I accept it? Yes, it's worth less than $50. Does it create an appearance problem that would then require me to file a written disclosure with my boss, the principal, that I got that gift? The answer is, it depends on the circumstances. All answers, all analysis about the law is only done after a review of all of the relevant facts. Not all situations create appearance problems. So let me just illustrate that a little further. I'll give you two scenarios. So I get the gift certificate from the teacher, from the parents of one of my students. I'm the teacher. And it occurs at the end of the school year. As a teacher, I have official dealings with folks. Students, parents, the community, administration, colleagues, what have you. Where I get that gift certificate at the end of the school year, and I'm no longer going to have official dealings with the student or the parents, it doesn't create an appearance problem. What's the appearance problem? Well, that after I get that gift certificate, I'm then going to show the student or the parents preferential treatment at the expense of all of the other people that I deal with. Where it's the end of the school year and I'm not going to have any further dealings with them, it doesn't create an appearance problem. I can accept the gift certificate. I don't have to file a disclosure. But what if I get the gift certificate in the middle of the school year? And, oh, by the way, the parents have asked me to write a letter of recommendation. They're trying to get their child into an AP class, a competitive environment, and they need that letter of recommendation. And, oh, by the way, the parents of many of my other students have made similar requests, and I can't write that many letters. I get that gift certificate, and a reasonable person, knowing all of the circumstances, could conclude that I could be improperly influenced. How? Well, will those parents get preferential treatment as a result of giving me that gift certificate? Will their request for a letter go to the top of the pile at the expense of the other parents who have made similar requests? Will that student get more of my time to help them learn the material at the expense of all of my other students who need as much of my time as I can provide? Whose interests are being served? And so where that appearance problem is created, where I get that gift certificate, I can accept it, but I have to file a written disclosure with my boss, the principal. I have to let him know that I got that gift certificate. And under this section of the law, agencies are free to adopt standards, even if they're more strict than the conflict law. So some agencies, for example, they have a policy on gift giving to their employees, like Massport, the state agency. Zero tolerance policy. No Massport employee can accept any item of any value from anyone that does any sort of business with Massport. That's stricter than what the conflict law requires, but the conflict law allows agencies to adopt those standards. So if I get that gift certificate from the parents and I file that disclosure to dispel any appearance problem, to create the transparency, if my boss, the principal, says, we have a personnel policy that says you cannot accept gifts from parents, well, that would control a personnel policy issue. So that's sort of the gift restriction rules under the conflict law. Bribes, they're just flat out prohibited, they're corrupt acts. Gifts worth $50 or more given in exchange for some official business, they're prohibited because those kinds of situations can undermine confidence in government. And then gifts worth $50 or more given because of official position are also restricted. So, what kinds of items of value might be restricted under the law? Well, any item of value, but these are the most common here that we deal with at the commission. Payment of meals, event tickets, travel expense reimbursements, gift certificates, floral arrangements, fruit baskets, lottery tickets, gifts offered through sales promotions. These are all based on actual enforcement cases that we've worked on. Somebody walks up to you and gives you a $50 scratch ticket because you're a public employee. Can you accept it? No, it's worth $50 or more. Well, what if you accept it and you scratch it and it comes up zero? Well, it still costs the person $50 or more. What if they came up to you and gave you a $2 scratch ticket? You can accept it, it's not worth $50 or more. You scratch it and you come up a $10,000 winner. Well, it's your lucky day, because it's a random sort of drawing kind of situation, which is allowed under the conflict law, where nothing is being given to you because of who you are. It's a strictly random chance as to whether you win anything or win nothing. Now, if you scratch it and win $10,000, you will have to file a disclosure with your boss that you got that scratch ticket and that you won $10,000, and who knows what will happen from that point. Also, I reference an advisor on event tickets, because event tickets can be a source of concern under the conflict of interest law. People who are offering public employees Red Sox tickets or tickets to theater or other events. In 2004, the Ethics Commission issued an advisory. An advisory is generalized advice on a given topic. Now, for those of us that can remember back to 2004, what would have prompted the Ethics Commission to issue an advisory on public employees accepting event tickets? Well, we had some wondrous events that occurred in the sporting world, events that I never in my lifetime thought I would ever see. The Red Sox and the Patriots. And so what happens? Well, you've got this feeding frenzy, so to speak, for access to these playoff games, World Series, Super Bowl, what have you. And so the commission, our legal division, we were getting inundated with questions from public employees, because we have some employees who deal with vendors, you deal with outside counsel, you deal with entities that have season, luxury boxes at the stadium and season tickets, and they're using those as marketing tools for their firms. They dole those out to their good customers or their best customers. And so public employees were contacting the Ethics Commission, can I accept the tickets from Labor Council? Can I accept it from our IT vendor, what have you? And so the commission, rather than have to deal with all of these questions piecemeal, put out the advisory, basically explaining the rules as I've discussed. You cannot accept, at the time in 2004, you can't accept anything worth $50 or more that's given because of your, or because of some official act performed or to be performed. Well, the public employees were saying, well, wait a minute, what if I pay for the tickets? And the commission explained two issues under the conflict law, where a vendor or somebody the public employee is dealing with has accepted event tickets like that. Number one is, if you pay face value to a World Series game, for a ticket to the World Series game, what is the actual value of that ticket? It is a heck of a lot more than face. And so the commission said, if the actual value exceeds face value by $50 or more, it's problematic under the conflict law. Secondly, if you're accepting tickets from a vendor that you deal with, somebody who is giving you those tickets because of your public position and the fact that they deal with you and they want to leverage their relationship with you, you are being given special access to an event that an average member of the public cannot share or enjoy. That special access alone is an item of substantial value, and it triggers or implicates the conflict of interest law. And so public employees were pushing a little bit further, saying, okay, well, what if I pay the full value of the ticket? And the commission said, okay, for the sake of argument, you still can't get around the special access. But say you pay full value for the ticket and there is no special access situation, you're simply picking your poison. You are choosing which law you want to violate. Because if you pay face value under that circumstance, you're not violating the conflict law because you're not to the plus by $50 or more. You're instead violating a criminal statute, scalping laws, because that person is not licensed to sell you that ticket at full market value. So the commission said in the advisory, the best judgment we can exercise is don't accept tickets from the people that we deal with or that are given to us because of who we are as public employees. Because in my experience in dealing with these situations, public employees lose their jobs. And never in our dealings has anyone ever said, yeah, that was worth it. It's never worth it. You have to think about what's going to happen if a situation blows up. And so you have to use your best judgment, and your best judgment should be don't accept tickets. Okay, the commission has promulgated regulations because not all situations involving providing items of value to public employees have a conflict of interest mischief attached. There are certain everyday situations that we go through where nobody is attempting to bribe us or leverage a relationship. They're not trying to extract anything from us. In those everyday situations where the commission endeavored to look at them and say, wait, if certain conditions apply, public employees can accept items worth $50 or more and it won't violate the conflict law. And so up here in the bullet points are categories where exemptions from the gift restriction rules are available. The first one is the most common one that folks use. It's the travel expense reimbursement. Because back in 2007, 8, 9, what was going on? The economy had downturned. Public agencies had limited resources that were being cut. Travel budgets were being cut and so forth. But public employees routinely attend events, conferences, seminars, where their agency has paid. The normal way it works in government is you incur an expense, your agency reimburses you for that expense. But what about situations where the agency doesn't, such as attending conferences? Well, the commission determined that there's real value in allowing public employees to attend conferences that are related to their job. That's where we learn stuff. We step outside of our normal relationships with people. That's where we learn best practices. That's where we learn new regulations and procedures. That's where we meet the people that we also deal with on a more formal basis as town employees. Basically, they create efficiencies. They help us do our jobs better. They teach us more about how to do our jobs. And we network with the people to learn more about them. So the commission said, as to the ability of public employees to have their expenses reimbursed in connection with events that serve a legitimate public purpose, such as conferences, it won't violate the conflict law if the public employee files a disclosure to create transparency that a private entity has expressed an interest in reimbursing their expenses, and the appointing authority or the public agency endorses the event by making a determination on that written disclosure that the employee's attendance at the event serves a legitimate public purpose. It takes out the conflict of interest mischief by transparency and agency endorsement. So we can attend conferences and have, if I'm an engineer, the town engineer, and our engineering consultant will be attending the same engineering conference that we all attend every year, and the town can't reimburse my expenses this year, but the engineering vendor has agreed to reimburse the expenses. Before, it's not allowed. Now, following this regulation, it is allowed. Incidental hospitality. Sometimes we get invited to events that are educational or informational in nature, and the host, some private entity, is serving food and beverage. Well, our legal division would get calls all the time from public employees saying, is this going to violate the gift rules if I go to the event? And if I do, can I partake of whatever food and beverage is being provided? And if I do I have to provide an itemization of what I had and how much each item cost to make sure it wasn't worth $50? So the commission promulgated a regulation that said, look, as to your ability to attend events that are educational or informational and where food and beverage is being served, you just file a disclosure. You create transparency, and then there's no conflict of interest issue. Because you have circumstances where the hospitality is just coffee and pastry. It doesn't rise to the level of an actual conflict of interest because the items aren't going to be worth $50 or more. But there could be like an all-day school where the host is a private entity and they're going to provide a meal. They're going to cater a meal after the class. And those catered events are always worth $50 or more. So there's a regulation available to allow us to work around the gift restriction rules. A couple of other ones I want to talk about. Unsolicited perishable items. People we deal with like to do nice things for us. Say they send us a bouquet of flowers to say thank you. You're dealing with the vendor. That costs $50 or more. Just the bouquet and the delivery charge is going to be $50 or more. What about an edible fruit basket? The commission promulgated a regulation as to perishable items. And it recognized that as to perishable items, it's impractical for a public employee who receives those to refuse or return them because they're perishable. So what the commission said in the regulation is as long as the perishable item is unsolicited, so that folks who deal with government don't conclude that there's some loophole in the law, public employees do not have to refuse perishable items as long as they can eliminate the element of the crime, so to speak, that being the $50 rule. How do you do that? You share the item so that no one public employee receives anything worth $50 or more. So say you get the floral bouquet from the vendor. It doesn't go into your office, it goes out in the lobby. Say you get the edible fruit basket. You take it to your office, you grab those chocolate-covered strawberries to the tune of $49.99, and then leave the apple slices and the pineapple for everyone else. But as long as you share the item and you don't get anything worth $50 or more, the regulation applies. So we can accept items without having to violate the conflict of interest. Teachers, if there are any teachers here, you'll be happy to learn that you have an enhanced gift restriction that while the rest of us are subject to this $50 rule, teachers can accept class gifts up to $150, as long as the individual contributors are unidentified. Because there's a recognition that, especially at the elementary school level, the students and the parents, they get gifts, gifts customary to an occasion for the teachers. And sometimes parents say, well, we want to make this meaningful, so we'd like to pool resources. And a 3-day cruise to Bermuda seems a bit much, so that's not allowed. But the commission has a regulation that says, okay, pooled resources, a class gift of up to $150 will be allowed, as long as the individual contributors are not identified. Why? So that the teacher is not put in a situation where they could be improperly influenced, where they would then have a bias because they know that somebody contributed to that gift. And the parents who were to contribute to a class gift under the regulation, they can't separately provide a gift worth $49.99 or less to the teacher. If you do the class gift, you cannot separately give a gift. If you don't contribute to a class gift, the rule is up to $49.99. But when you make such a gift to a teacher, the teacher may be in a position of having to file a disclosure to dispel the appearance problem. Think about my example and the gift certificate to my favorite restaurant. I can accept it, but it creates an appearance problem because a reasonable person will wonder whether somebody's going to get preferential treatment as a result. Random drawings. So you attend a conference and the host is saying, hey, we're gonna award or give out an iPad. So put your business card in the fishbowl and we're gonna make this drawing, and you put your business card in the fishbowl. As long as it's a random drawing, like lottery tickets, you don't know if it's gonna win at all. So public employees can accept items worth more than $50 if it's in connection with a random drawing, as long as it's a random drawing. A rigged game is not, does not comply with the statute. If the host is a vendor and they've got a contract proposal and you have to make the important decisions about whether and who is going to get the contract, and the person reaches in the fishbowl to figure out who's going to win the iPad, and it's your business card taped to their palm, that's the rigged game, that's not going to work. Okay. That's the gift restriction rules under the conflict law. Any questions? What can public employees accept, what can't they? The commission can also aggregate. So if you're meeting with a vendor and they buy your lunch and it's $20, it doesn't violate the gift restriction rules, but you would be required to file a disclosure with the boss that they did that. But if there are multiple occurrences, if you have a monthly meeting with the vendor and they're always picking up the tab and it's all related to the same type of public business, the commission can aggregate those individual events. Once you get to $50, and as you can imagine, it won't take much, it then becomes actionable as a violation of the gift restriction rules. Okay, let's move on from the gift restriction rules to financial interest conflicts under the section we call nepotism or self-dealing. Situations where public employees, rather than serve the public interest, might be looking at lining their own pockets. Nepotism, taking care of friends and family. Self-dealing, performing your public duties with an eye towards benefiting yourself at the expense of the public that you serve. Financial interest conflicts. The law says you as a public employee cannot perform your duties if certain financial interests are affected. Yours, your immediate family members, not all of your relatives, but your closest in relatives. Any business organization, your private employer, or if you own or operate a business, if you have a business partner, as a public employee, you cannot participate or do your job if the matter will affect those financial interests. Also, if you're negotiating for employment with anyone, you cannot leverage your public position with an eye towards benefiting any future career prospects. So if you're dealing with a vendor, as a public employee, you're making important decisions about the vendor and the work they're doing for the town, and you make decisions about whether are they performing under the contract, do we recommend that they get their scheduled payment for the work they're supposed to have done. If you then negotiate for employment or you're looking for employment with them, you have to stop any further activities as a town employee. The terms we use at the Ethics Commission in connection with financial interest conflicts that reflect a public employee stepping back are abstain and recuse. To us, they mean the same thing. They'll have a different meaning in a different context, but they mean the same thing. Public employee poised to perform their job, having to step back because certain financial interests are affected. There is a workaround in the law that allows the town to waive the statute if it's in the best interest of the town. The law says, as an appointed public employee, if you encounter a financial interest conflict, you've got to step back from that matter. But certain things, not all financial interest conflicts are significant. Some of them involve routine administrative matters. And if the town thinks it's in the best interest of the town to allow you to continue to do your job, the law has a mechanism that allows it. The first is you have to file a written disclosure with your appointing authority that you have a financial interest conflict that requires you to step back from the matter. And then the appointing authority, using your disclosure form, makes a determination. What are we going to do about it? And they can do one of three things. They can take the responsibility for that issue from you and handle it themselves, or they can assign someone else to handle it, or if they think that the integrity of your services are not going to be affected by your handling the matter, they can waive the statute. This is an important tool when you're dealing with such issues as collective bargaining. Because say I'm the police chief and I have a son or a daughter who's a police officer. Can I participate in collective bargaining? No, it's a matter that will affect their financial interests. But you know what? Either the town manager or outside labor counsel, they're the chief negotiator for the town. The department heads are an important piece of collective bargaining. They inform that process. To not have the assistance of the department head really could be a detriment to the town's position. So the law contains a workaround that says, all right, if you have a financial interest conflict, as long as you file a disclosure with your appointing authority to create transparency, the appointing authority can decide what to do. And one of the options is they can make a determination that the integrity of your services won't be affected, and it allows you to participate. If I'm the police chief and I have a son or a daughter working in the department, I've got issues that occur routinely. Can I hire my son or daughter to be a police officer? Absolutely not. That's a significant financial interest conflict. Can I supervise them? No. Can I direct someone else as to how they're going to be supervised? No. Those are all matters that will affect their financial interest. Pay, benefits, assignments, overtime, court time, you name it. But one of the things I have to do as a department head to comply with municipal finance law once every 2 weeks is certify the payroll for my department. I don't prepare the payroll. All I do to certify payroll is put my name on it. Staff prepares the payroll. That's a routine administrative matter. My signing off on that payroll sheet, certifying the payroll for my department, if I sign off on it, I'm participating in a matter that affects the financial interest of my immediate family member. Because by signing, everybody gets paid. If I don't sign because I have a financial interest conflict in the matter, nobody gets paid. So how do we work around that? It's not a big deal as far as financial interest conflicts go, so there's a workaround in the law that says, I file the disclosure with my appointing authority and they decide what to do. Do they want to certify the payroll for my department? Do they want to assign someone else to certify the payroll? Or they can make the determination that the integrity of my services are not going to be affected by my signing off on payroll, and then I can do that without violating the conflict law. For board members, just understand that matters affecting abutters and business competitors can implicate this section of the law. For example, if I serve on the planning board, and the planning board has to decide all major development issues in the town, and Walmart has just submitted a permit to the planning board to put a big box store in, and it's going to be right next door to my house. Do I want that there? I don't know. Is that a matter that's going to affect my financial interests? Most definitely. So I have to abstain from that matter. Because although it's not my application, because I'm in a abutter, and it can be argued that my financial interests are going to be affected, this nepotism section applies. So say also, business competitors. Say I serve on the the license board in the town, and I own a package store. Can I serve on the license board if I own a package store? Yes. The conflict law doesn't preclude any class of citizenry from serving government. It only may restrict what they can do once they serve government. So I can own a package store and serve on the license board, because the license board does more than just issue licenses or deal with package stores issues. There's the restaurant issues, there's the all alcohol, there's the one-day licenses, you name it. What if there are 3 package stores in the town? It's a small town. And I serve on the license board and I own a package store. And one of my competitors gets caught serving somebody who's underage. They're now coming before my board facing a possible loss of their license. If I can knock one of my business competitors out of the game for a period of time, is that a matter that's going to affect my business's financial interest? I don't know. But if the answer to that question is yes, then the nepotism section applies. But it's what we call a rebuttable presumption. Like if I live in Worcester and there are 100 package stores and mine is on the west side of town, and and then another package store on the east side of town gets caught in that situation, arguably we're not competitors. We're too far away from each other. Question?
If a board member recuses themselves from a hearing, are they required to leave the room, or is it okay for them to just leave the table and sit in the room?
That's a good question for the benefit of the future audience. If a board member recuses and they're not going to participate in a hearing or an application, or no matter what the issue is that the board is dealing with, do they have to leave the room? And the answer is no, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. I think, do I have it? Yes, so we're jumping ahead. What does it mean to abstain? Because we see variations, and people get confused. We see situations where somebody will be at the table saying, I'm recusing myself from further participation, and they don't leave the table. Or they recuse and then they go sit in the audience. Or they recuse and they then leave the room. So which is correct? A, B, C, or D, all of the above? And the answer is all of the above. The conflict law simply says you cannot participate. You cannot participate substantively. You can't discuss, you can't vote, you can't do anything in furtherance of that issue. You just have to not participate. Question?
Well, isn't there a distinction between recusal and abstaining?
Not for conflict of interest law purposes, and that's what I said earlier. In our world, recuse and abstain mean the same thing. Because you have some people that they're asked for their vote. You vote yes, you vote no, or I abstain. Are they voting if they say I abstain? With us, we don't make that distinction. You're just stepping back from the matter. So we see situations, these variations that I've talked about. So what we say is, look, the law simply says you cannot participate. But you need to think about these situations. Is there a potential that they can blow up? If you abstain from a matter and you remain at the table, you may not be doing everything possible to keep someone from getting the wrong idea about what you were doing and then calling the Ethics Commission. We get those complaints. And if we think that we need to review those matters, we will review those matters. And we review those matters by looking at all of the available records and talking to everyone who was present. Yes, Jim?
Is this a matter that the selectmen could take up to create a town policy?
Well, I don't know. That's something that I would reserve for council to talk about, because state law does not require, the state law says, as I've discussed, if you have a financial interest, you cannot participate. Whether the town can implement a policy, I've seen towns that have done so, but they didn't include an enforcement mechanism. They just said, if you encounter any conflict of interest, you must abstain, and that's all it said. And so when people didn't comply with the policy, then people tried to refer it to the Ethics Commission. We don't enforce town policy. So, I mean, it's something that would maybe worth future discussion, but as a bottom line, statutory requirement, if you have to abstain, then you do, because there's a financial interest conflict. So did you have a question?
Just two if I can, because you just on with this one. Are there circumstances in which you must leave the room?
No.
No,
There are none, but let me explain where you want to use your best judgment as to how you respond to a situation. You can abstain and remain at the table, but you're not necessarily insulating yourself from a possible complaint to the Ethics Commission. And if the Ethics Commission gets that complaint and we think for whatever reasons that we need to look at it further, you're not going to be happy about it. Because we are duty bound to take the available facts given to us, establish additional facts which either support or refute the allegation. And all of my years of doing that kind of work for the Commission, because my background is pretty much from the enforcement end before I got into the public education stuff, never after concluding, where somebody abstained but didn't leave the table there, and we wanted to be sure that there was no issue. After we were done and we said, yeah, we're satisfied that there was no nepotism issue and that you weren't, that you did abstain properly, it's never a situation where they say, thanks, let's do that one again, that was nice. Because it's not. And so you want to not only comply with the law, but think about whether what you're doing will protect yourself to the extent possible. Because if you're a volunteer and you have that happen to you, you're going to be like, is this worth it all? And those are good questions that happen. So you can abstain and remain at the table, but you want to think about that. You can also abstain and sit in the audience. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, think about my Walmart example. Now, if I'm on the planning board and Walmart wants to put in a big box store next to my house, I can't participate in that matter as a planning board member. But guess what? I'm still a resident, a taxpayer, a voter. And I want or don't want, and probably don't want, and I'm going to be heard. Now, I can't have my planning board hat on in that perspective, but I can abstain, sit in the audience, and then when the public hearing is conducted, when it's appropriate, as long as I don't push myself to the front of the line, and I don't invoke my planning board position in any of my comments, I can speak as a private citizen and say, whether I would support or not support that. But then the third option I talked about is abstaining and leaving the room. Now, the conflict law doesn't require it, so why would we say that? Well, the court's considered a conflict situation, and in its decision it said the wisest course of action is to leave the room. Why would they say that if the law doesn't require it? Because when you leave the room, you remove all doubt. believe me, we get the complaints. And it comes something like this. Somebody will call, so-and-so sits on this board, the board voted to award a contract to this guy's, family member's company. He violated the conflict law. Well, how did he violate the conflict law? Well, what do you mean? Well, did he abstain? Well, he said he was, but he remained at the table. Well, what did he do? Well, what do you mean? Well, did he talk about the matter? No. Did he vote on the matter? No. Well, what did he do? Well, by his very presence, it was intimidating to his fellow board members. They wouldn't dare vote against his interests. Or they were sharing hand signals. They were making eye contact. There were a lot of nonverbals going on. Well, that doesn't happen. But that doesn't mean we don't get those kinds of complaints. When you leave the room, you remove all doubt. Nobody can then try to argue that you actually participated in a matter that you didn't. Questions? Okay.
Can I just go back? You said that doesn't happen? What do you mean?
Well, collusion. Board members don't necessarily collude because when you serve in government and you're a volunteer, you're there to serve the public interest. You're not going to sacrifice your reputation for someone else. Like if I serve on a board with this person and this person says, hey, I really want you to vote on this because it's going to affect, I'm voting in a way that preserves my reputation and my integrity. So the issue in the example I provided was that there's some sort of collusion going on, and I'm just telling you that in our experience it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen.
Might need to attend some meetings.
You have to be
Well, I
careful.
mean, you can draw whatever conclusions based on what your observations are, but in my experience, the way something appears on the front end when it comes in as a complaint with us and the way it appears when we're done with it, it's usually not the same. And we get those kinds of complaints, and where appropriate, we will review those. But I can't count on one hand the number of times where we've been able to substantiate that there was collusion among board members who are not otherwise business associates related or really tight in some fashion.
Okay, so can I just follow up? So that you finally explained. You could not prove.
Right.
You didn't say it doesn't happen. You just said it didn't.
Oh, absolutely.
Happens all the time.
It's like I would say, nobody ever lied to the Ethics Commission. People lie to us all the time. We don't have an obstruction of justice statute that prohibits that. You lie to an FBI agent, that's a violation of federal law. That's a criminal offense just for the fact that you lied to them. But for the Ethics Commission, we have a perjury provision of the law that we have to go and have the AG enforce criminally if we can prove it. But otherwise, yeah.
But can I just go back? We had the suggestion that the selectmen should set the rule. Now, shouldn't that be an obvious rule? If you have a partner, I mean, you're sitting on a board and someone else has an interest in someone being given the contract, and is winking at you or gives you a free meal the night before, it's a bloody obvious violation. You should get off the table. Now, shouldn't that be a rule that selectmen say? Out of the room.
The rule is you cannot participate in a matter that affects your financial interest, and you cannot engage in any conduct which gives anyone any sort of preferential treatment. In other words, where people are entitled to certain things, they're allowed to it. But if they're not entitled to it, but they get something because it's a wink, wink, nod, nod.
Why couldn't the selectmen set a rule that if that situation arises, you cannot sit at the table?
And I can't answer that. I don't know.
You can't answer it.
You can talk it over and see whether it would pass muster. It would be something that would probably need to be voted on at town meeting, and then would the Attorney General approve it? Is it constitutional? Don't know.
That conflicts with the right of a citizen to speak on behalf of an issue. So if I'm a planning board member, a ZBA member that's a butter to something, I can recuse and speak from the audience as a private citizen, which is dicey, but it still seems to be a good balance.
And the gentleman brings up a good point. We don't lose our rights. There are First Amendment issues in play in a lot of things that we look at. And we have to balance First Amendment with conflict of interest restrictions. The conflict law restrictions are meant to be meaningful restrictions because they serve a purpose. And so in all things, you have to be able to articulate, okay, what is that public purpose? And if you just say, if you're even remotely connected to something, you cannot, there's no basis in law to say that, because especially if you're an elected board member, you are free to exercise all of the powers and duties of the board members. And what you're suggesting is that some other board can restrict your powers and duties, and it's just not the way it works. But that doesn't mean that the municipality can't thoughtfully review and decide whether it's appropriate. And then, as I said, if they do, they should just make sure they have an available enforcement mechanism if there's a violation, or otherwise it's really just a policy that has no teeth. Okay, let's go back to where we were. We're talking about financial interest conflicts, nepotism, self-dealing. Now, immediate family. It's not all of your family members. You cannot participate in a matter that affects your financial interest or the financial interest of immediate family members. That term is defined in the conflict law, and those folks are up on the chart. It's you, your spouse, your parents, your spouse's parents, your siblings, your spouse's siblings, and your children, your immediate family members. You can't participate in matters affecting your financial interests or their financial interests. Now, this then begs the question, well, what about all of my other relatives? What about the non-immediate family members, those not on the chart? What happens if a matter comes before my board that affects their financial interests? Well, the law says for it to be a nepotism violation, the person has to fit the definition of immediate family. So if they don't, it doesn't mean that there's no conflict law issue. It simply means it's not a nepotism issue. So what about matters that affect the financial interests of non-immediate family members? First of all, who are they? Cousins, aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews, grandparents, grandchildren, ex-spouses, domestic partners. Not on the chart, not a nepotism situation. But by default, if it's not a financial interest conflict situation, even though there's a financial interest component, it becomes what we call a non-financial interest conflict, which falls under the Code of Conduct section of the law, which we'll get into in just a little bit. The Code of Conduct section would say that's a situation that creates an appearance problem. You first have to file a written disclosure with your appointing authority or with the town clerk before you deal with matters that affect the financial interests of non-immediate family members. Okay, rule of necessity. Is anyone a member of an elected board? Okay, there's a provision not in the conflict law, but that was crafted by the courts. Look at my Walmart situation. Say I serve on the planning board and it's an elected planning board. Walmart has filed an application to put in a store right next door to my property. I have to abstain. But if it's a 5-member planning board, there are 4 other members that can deal with the matter. The board can still put a quorum together. But what if 2 of my fellow board members are also abutters? They live in my neighborhood. All of a sudden, you have 3 out of 5 members who cannot meet, who have to abstain because they have financial interest conflicts. What does the board do? It can only have 2 members to meet. Well, the courts have said whenever there's an impediment to government operations, a workaround must be found. So in connection with financial interest conflicts, the court said the rule of necessity, and it's a term they invented, is appropriate to allow all of the board members, even those with conflicts, to participate. Now, what it means is the rule of necessity is something that must be invoked by the board. The Ethics Commission put out an advisory. It's up on our website, on the appropriate use of the rule of necessity. To appropriately use the rule of necessity, a board which cannot put a quorum together because of nepotism conflicts for a majority of the members needs to obtain legal advice, either from town council or the Ethics Commission's legal division, about the appropriate use of the rule, because it is possible to improperly invoke the rule of necessity. And if a board improperly invokes the rule, they don't get the protections that the rule affords. What are those protections? You can participate despite having a nepotism conflict issue without facing jeopardy under the conflict law. So the board has to obtain legal advice. Is this an appropriate use of the rule of necessity? If the answer to that is yes, and that means it's a last resort. There is no other workaround for the board to use to otherwise deal with this issue. It can't pass its authority or responsibility off to another person or another board. The board is legally required to deal with it. Then it's an appropriate use of the rule. Then during the relevant meeting, when the issue is up on the agenda, one of the affected board members has to invoke the rule of necessity. Then any of the board members who have the nepotism conflicts, the financial interest conflicts, have to disclose for the record the nature of their conflict. Once that is done, all of those members can vote on the matter. They can discuss and vote on the matter. They properly invoke the rule. Now, The reason I say it can be improperly invoked, we had a case involving a city council in one of our cities around Boston where there were 7 members of the city council. A very controversial development issue went before the council to be decided. 4 of those 7 members had conflicts of interest. 2 of them were financial interest conflicts. They were required to abstain. 2 of them had what we call code of conduct, appearances of conflict issues. They could have continued to participate in the matter. They just needed to file written disclosures of their respective conflicts. But instead, the chairman of the city council, the president of the city council, invoked the rule of necessity, saying 4 members had conflicts. The 2 members that simply needed to file disclosures, they stated publicly, we need to abstain because we have a conflict of interest. So they had 4 members who were declaring they had to abstain because of conflicts of interest. The board invoked the rule of necessity. All of those members voted on the issue. When we learned about it later and we sorted out the respective conflicts, we said, you improperly invoked the rule. You 2 had to abstain, but the board could still put 5 members together, a quorum, to decide the matter. The 2 members who also had conflicts simply had to file written disclosures of the nature of their conflicts. They weren't otherwise required to abstain. They could abstain if they wanted to, but the law wouldn't require it. So the board improperly invoked the rule. Guess what, you 2? Get the checkbooks out. This one's gonna hurt. The commission took action as to those 2 members because the board improperly invoked the rule of necessity.
Now, question?
Yes?
Well, what happens if you have 4 and they're all out, clearly out? Can one person vote? I mean, is it a reverse?
No, you have to have a majority of the board members. And then the question is, depending on the issue, do you have to have a majority of the board or a majority of the board present and voting? That's the tricky issue.
You have 5 members, and 4 are clearly conflicted. I mean, in a major
You can't
way.
have one person
You can't
deciding
have
that.
one person vote.
Yeah, no. So, but it would be a situation where the rule of necessity might be appropriate. But not all. We have a situation where a mayor had his brother, who was a police officer, and there was a civil service promotion for sergeant, and there were going to be like 6 people that could be promoted to sergeant. The mayor's brother was one of those. The mayor was legally required to make those appointments. There was nobody else there that could make those appointments. So the commission gave advice to the mayor saying, you have to abstain from this matter, but you can invoke the rule of necessity for the purposes of assigning your authority to make these decisions to someone else. In that case, it was the city solicitor. So you can invoke the rule strictly for this specific purpose, and then you otherwise have to stay out of the matter. So it gets kind of tricky, and that's sort of the point. And I don't mean to sort of, jump into the weeds full bore on this, but just to give you some idea that the law is fairly nuanced, fairly confusing, and to sort of underscore the point that it is confusing, and when situations come up, make sure you call us. Okay, the code of conduct section. We're making great time, aren't we? I've got 15 minutes to go through, probably about another 45 minutes of material, so we'll hit second gear. Yes, Jim?
Can I just go back to that rule of necessity again?
Sure.
Just to be clear on something. Are you saying that this is only as it applies to ethics issues?
Well, everything I talk about applies, it's how the conflict of interest law applies. I wouldn't say the term ethics. Does the conflict of interest law apply to nepotism situations? Yes. Is there a workaround if a board cannot put a quorum together? Yes, it's called the rule of necessity, not contained in the conflict law, but we use relevant court decisions to guide how we review those kinds of situations. And one final point, thank you for steering me back. The rule of necessity is only available to elected boards. It is not available to appointed boards. Why? Because appointed boards already have a workaround in the conflict law. You have a financial interest conflict, you file a written disclosure with your appointing authority, and they can decide what's in the best interest of the town as to whether you can participate or not participate. But elected boards, those people do not have an appointing authority. There is no workaround but for the rule of necessity. Okay, the code of conduct deals with non-financial interest conflicts. And the code of conduct basically breaks down into 2 categories. Appearances of conflict of interest, improper use of public position. As to appearances of conflict of interest, I've talked about it all night. Situations where people could reasonably conclude that you could be improperly influenced, you have to file a disclosure before you participate. The law says this: you are a public employee. You may not act in a manner in which a reasonable person, knowing all of the circumstances, could conclude that you would act with bias, that you would show preferential treatment because of your relationship with some entity or person that's before your board or before your town department where you have to decide matters. Appearances of conflict. It says you're still going to do your job the way you're supposed to. You will continue to serve the public interest, but just because those circumstances are present, they constitute an appearance of a conflict of interest. What is required under the law is the public employee, before they perform their duties, has to file that written disclosure containing all of the relevant facts of that appearance problem to create transparency. They can then perform their duties. They're still required to serve the public interest. What happens in situations where somebody has a private interest in the matter and they don't serve the public interest? They instead use their position to secure an unwarranted privilege for someone. Well, that constitutes an improper use of public position. The law under this section of the law says the public employee may not use their official position to secure for themselves or others unwarranted privileges which are of substantial value, $50 or more, and not available to similarly situated individuals. Let me give you an example to illustrate. So I work for the town and I have one job. I issue a permit. Could be a transfer station sticker, beach sticker, you name it. Anybody who wants my permit has to follow two steps. They have to fill out a permit application. They then have to pay a permit fee. Now, I use the term substantial value as I've used it before. It's anything worth $50 or more. So let's say the permit fee is $100. And anybody who wants my permit has to follow those two steps. One day my Uncle Harry comes in and he wants a permit. And I tell him, Uncle Harry, today's your lucky day. Today you get the friends and family discount. Fill out the application, but you don't have to pay the fee and I'll give you the permit. Well, where everyone has to follow those two steps and I unilaterally decide, because it's somebody I'm privately connected to, that Uncle Harry doesn't have to pay the permit fee, that's an improper use of my public position. I am using my official position to secure for someone, myself or someone else, an unwarranted privilege of substantial value. Why is it an unwarranted privilege? Because in doing my job, I'm a public employee. And as you are all fully aware now, you don't get to make up the rules as you go along. Everything you do is guided by something, whether it's policy, procedure, statute, ordinance, bylaw, regulation, you name it. You have to treat similar matters similarly. Part of the reason is because we serve the public interest, everybody gets treated the same. We're not allowed to use our positions to extend preferential treatment for ourselves or others. Had a case involving a DPW director and a deputy director. The DPW bought a new wood chipper because the DPW workers were using the wood chipper to trim the trees along the roadways. And one day the deputy director says, Director, we don't work on the weekends and I need to take down some trees on my property. Can I take the chipper home? Director said, nobody's using it, why not? So we did. Is that a problem? Why? Nobody's using it. Well, guess what? That stuff costs money, a lot of money. That stuff depreciates. That stuff wears out. That stuff breaks. The more you use it, the more likely you will incur costs in the future. And if you're letting employees take the stuff home, it's an unwarranted privilege. Because if I needed a wood chipper as a taxpayer, I got to go to the equipment rental place and spend money to rent a wood chipper. So if I see that the director has allowed the deputy director to take the wood chipper home, aren't I within my rights to go to the director and say, hey, that was a nice thing you did. Next week, I want to use it because I got to take some trees down on my property. And don't I have the right to expect that I could? Well, yeah, in that kind of an environment, but it's unworkable. Towns have to restrict the use of town property. I work for the DPW and we have a snowstorm and I'm plowing. And every time I have to plow the town roads, I go to my church and I plow out my church parking lot. Is that a problem? Seems like a nice thing to do. But you know what? I'm a resident. I don't go to that church. I go to that church. So when you're done plowing out your church parking lot, kindly go over to my church and plow out my church parking lot as well. And don't I have the right to expect that? Obviously, it's unworkable. That's why public resources can only be used for public purposes. And any abusive, non-public use of a public resource constitutes an improper use of one's public position. Code of conduct, appearances of conflict of interest, improper use of public position. Disclosing confidential information. For you public employees, you understand that we work in government, we understand public records law requirements, but not everything that we review or receive is public information. Some stuff is confidential. What kind of stuff do we deal with that's confidential? Well, personnel information, medical information, if we have kids in the school district, pupil information. If I want a town job and I have to pass a background check, and so I undergo a Corey background check, Corey information is restricted under state law. If I have a child in the school district and they're receiving special education services under an IEP, that is strictly confidential under both federal and state law. If you are a public employee who normally receives or reviews confidential information, under the conflict law, you may not disseminate that. You may not share it with anyone who's not authorized to receive or review it. We had a case involving a clerk in one of our district courts. Now, court clerks don't have access to Corey information. We know Corey information is confidential. This clerk had a relative who was running for an election locally. So one day, the clerk went to her best friend in the court, Mr. Probation Officer. They have access to Corey information. She asked the probation officer to run a Corey check on her relative's opponent in the upcoming election. The probation officer wasn't given any context as to the nature of the request, so thought it was a legitimate business request, ran the Corey check, came up with an arrest record, which he then provided to the clerk, who then provided it to her relative, who then released it to the media. Guess who won the election? The commission learned of the conduct well afterwards, but we were still in a position to investigate and enforce the statute. And when we did, the commission in its decision said, Madam Clerk, respectfully, even though you're not cleared to receive Corey information, once you receive that information, you were obligated to keep it confidential. Instead, you disseminated that information to somebody who was not authorized to receive it, and you did so to further a personal purpose. And that's the trigger that gets our antenna up. Improperly disclosing confidential information to further a personal purpose. Now, this requirement survives our public employment. We cannot improperly disclose confidential information while we're public employees, but guess what? The Ethics Commission as a law enforcement agency has a 6-year statute of limitations. Even after a public employee would leave public service, if it's within that 6 years and we learn that they improperly disclose confidential information, it is actionable. This is what keeps private entities from hiring away key public employees so that the public employees can reveal all of the state secrets, so to speak, to help these private entities get business they might not otherwise be able to get. Okay.
Question?
Yes.
Can I go back to the first one here? First bullet point?
Yes?
If I am required to file a disclosure for the appearance of conflict, let's say, and I don't do it, and let's say a month later, after I act on whatever the issue was, I do file that disclosure, is that the same thing as not having filed one?
So the question is, what happens if I don't timely file a disclosure, but I eventually file a disclosure? Well, it's not technically complying with the statute, because one of the things I've neglected, you guys are great, feed me the right questions, how any disclosure to comply with the conflict law has to be filed in advance.
Right.
In advance. So what happens in situations where somebody doesn't file a disclosure or they file it late? It doesn't cure the violation, but in our enforcement discretion, we may determine that it mitigates the violation. So what it might mean is if there was an intent to comply with the statute, but it wasn't technically correct because it wasn't timely filed, we might say that because it was filed, while there's a violation, we're not going to take public enforcement action on it. And we do that even if a disclosure is not timely filed, even when we get it. In some cases, we'll look at it and say, look, you needed to file a disclosure. We're not going to take action here, but you have to file that disclosure, and we'll expect it to be filed within 30 days. And we want evidence that you did it. So as a matter of resolving cases, we'll say, you should have filed it, now go ahead and file it. Good question, thank you. Yes?
I had a question on the filing appearance of conflict for appointed officials. If you have a conflict, can you file the appearance and say, I have a conflict, but I'm filing the appearance of a conflict?
Well, the whole point of the disclosure is to create transparency. One of the requirements when you file that kind of a disclosure is, I'm going to be able to act impartially, and I'm going to continue to perform my duties. I'm filing the disclosure. Here is the nature of my conflict.
But are there some conflicts that aren't?
That aren't disclosable, yes. Nepotism conflicts are not, you can't disclose your way out of those. An improper use of public position, you cannot disclose your way out of those. Because when you violate the law because you improperly used your public position, what will a disclosure serve? Certainly not going to serve the public interest. The whole point of disclosure is to create transparency so that to the extent we have any biases, they're out in the open, they're in the light of day. It doesn't mean that if we disclose a situation that it's not a conflict violation. In my example of providing the friends and family discount to my Uncle Harry, if I file a disclosure that I did that, it doesn't cure the violation, because the violation is not that there was this appearance of conflict of interest. The violation is I improperly used my public position. A disclosure doesn't fix an improper use of public position. It only fixes an appearance of a conflict of interest where you will otherwise perform your duties the way you're supposed to.
But can you file the disclosure to say, allow yourself to sit on something where, say, your family member is before your board?
It could, if it's not a financial interest conflict. And as I said, if it's an immediate family member and their financial interests are affected, the nepotism section says you can't participate. But if you have an appointing authority, one of the workarounds is you can file the disclosure with your appointing authority, and if they decide it's okay, and they decide in writing, then you're okay. But otherwise, if you don't, you can sit at the table, but you can't discuss or vote or, glare or share hand signals or anything like that.
So just filing the form does not mean
Right.
anything. The appointing authority has to write their opinion on your
On
disclosure.
a financial interest conflict, yes.
But that doesn't work for elected boards.
Right, if you're an elected,
Elected.
you have to have an appointing authority for a financial interest conflict disclosure to apply. If you are elected, you don't have an appointing authority. If an elected official encounters a financial interest conflict, they have one response. They step back from the matter. There is no workaround unless the rule of necessity applies because a board can't put a quorum together. But just for disclosure purposes, a disclosure serves to create transparency so that the public, looking at the conduct of public employees, where they think the fix is in, or where somebody might be in a position to get favorable treatment, the disclosure serves to put those cards on the table so that there's no hidden agendas going on. As I said earlier, public employees are not allowed to perform their duties with any hidden or undisclosed conflicts. And everything is predicated on you doing your job. You're going to do your job, and in certain situations, before you do your job, you might have to put the cards on the table.
So say the conflict is with a business partner. Every single time that partner comes before your board, you have to fill out a new conflict?
Theoretically, yes, because in order for a conflict law disclosure to comply with the law, it has to be a written statement of all relevant facts. And those facts will always change depending on the circumstances. If your business partner is in real estate development, he may be before your board concerning development subdivision A, and then 2 months later he's before your board concerning subdivision B. There are relevant facts that are now different. A new disclosure is required every time the facts change. Now, what happens if the facts don't change? Such as I'm a department head and my department hired a relative of mine. Well, that disclosure is good for all situations unless the relevant facts change, such as, well, we hired this person at this level and then they just got a promotion and I'm required to act on that. The relevant facts have changed so that I would have to file a new disclosure. But as an ongoing matter, if I file the disclosure that this person works in my department and everything I do, those facts don't otherwise change, then I don't have to continually file disclosures. It all depends. Confused? Heck yes. That's my job. Call our office if you have any questions when actual situations come up. Okay, now what I'm going to say now is we are now at the end. I have more material to cover, But if you need to leave, please do not feel inhibited. Just go ahead and take off. I'm going to talk about a couple of situations under the Code of Conduct section. Political activity. Can public employees use public resources in connection with campaign or political activity? No. To do so would constitute an improper use of public position. Why? Because campaigns, political activity, that's the people's business, not government's. Government is not in the business of deciding or influencing elections. Therefore, public resources cannot be used in connection with any campaign or political activity. We have an advisory on our website which more fully explains it because it gets nuanced. It's obvious if I'm a candidate for office, I cannot be using my office resources to print out my campaign materials, to solicit nominating signatures, any of that stuff, soliciting people to my fundraisers, what have you. But it gets kind of nuanced when you're talking about things like overrides. What happens if there's an override proposed to build a new school and I'm a school committee member? Well, the rule on political activity has flexibility where if you are a public employee and you're on a board that will be affected by some campaign or political activity, you may be allowed to participate in the process to the point where you are informing the public discussion. Policymakers have certain flexibility under the conflict law to inform the public discussion and use public resources in connection with that, but they cannot use extraordinary public resources and they cannot advocate. So it would be appropriate if there's a 2.5 override to build a new school for the school committee to talk about that override at a school committee meeting and to have that stuff reflected in the normal documents of the school committee, such as the minutes or what have you, and posted on the website. Technically, that could be use of public resources in connection with campaign or political activity, but it's allowed because they're policymakers. If there's a 2.5 override to build a new police station, well, the town manager, the board of selectmen, the police chief, the policymakers, they can participate to the extent they're informing the public discussion. But if I'm a patrolman, I'm not in a policy-making position. It is not my job as a patrolman to advocate or otherwise discuss whether we need a new police station. So I cannot use public resources in any way, shape, or form in connection with those questions. Point being, it gets nuanced. We have an advisory on our website. If any of this resonates, you can check that out. There's also, what about situations where public employees go into private business deals together? You're a department head, your subordinate paints houses on the side, you need your house painted. Can you approach your subordinate at work about painting your house? No. Why? Because that is inherently exploitive. The subordinate may not feel free to reject the overture. So there's a whole process that has to be laid out. Dealings amongst public employees or with public employees and members of the public or what have you, they're not prohibited, but they have to be conditioned so that any appearance of a conflict is removed from the equation. So this advisory explains all of that. If I want a subordinate who paints houses, if I want to approach them to paint my house, can I do it? Yes. Can I do it on the job? No. How can I do it? Well, if they otherwise advertise their business, and they advertise their business if they have the phone number for the business publicly available, that would suggest they are initiating any business for their painting business. I can then, off the job, contact them about painting my house. I cannot ask for any inducement. They cannot provide any inducement. No discounts, no favoritism, no leveraging, no exploiting. And it's both ways, because if I'm the subordinate, the boss has said, hey, will you paint my house? I might, if I do him a solid by giving, or her a solid by giving a discount or some other inducement in order to leverage my public position, that also implicates the conflict law. We look at it most seriously when it's supervisors, managers in their dealings with subordinate, because that's inherently exploitive. But the other way around is also in play, because subordinates may want to leverage relationships with managers and supervisors. It gets fairly complicated. This advisory explains that. Okay, I have 2 sections, actually 3 sections to go, but 2 sections, I'm just going to gloss over them. These are the most confusing sections, and so I want to go so fast that you have no hope of understanding, just to raise the red flag for you so that you call us if it comes up. These are off the job. I've talked about how the conflict law applies to us on the job. Gift restriction rules, nepotism rules, code of conduct rules, constituting appearances of conflict and improper use of public position. even when we're off the job, if in our off-the-job capacity, if our private stuff also involves the town, the conflict law can apply. There is a provision in the conflict law that says you cannot act as any third party's representative or work on private stuff for pay if the town is also involved in some fashion. Here's what the law says. See if you can figure this one out. A municipal employee may not act as an agent or attorney for or receive compensation from anyone other than the town in connection with any matter in which the town is a party or has a direct and substantial interest. What it basically means is that the conflict law imposes a duty of loyalty on you to the town. So in any of your private stuff, if it also involves a town, your loyalty to the town is required under the law. You may not represent third-party interests in matters that also involve the town unless it falls under one of the exceptions I'm going to talk about briefly. But that's sort of the duty of loyalty requirement, and it comes in two forms. Your ability to represent a third-party interest before the town, your ability to be paid privately to work on a matter. Like if I work for the town DPW, but I also work for my uncle's company and they lay water line, they install water line, can I work doing that water line work in the town I work for? No, because you would be paid by some private entity, someone other than the town, to work on something where the town also has a direct and substantial interest. The town has a direct and substantial interest in any matters where it can exercise governmental authority, such as inspection, permitting, etc. So for you board members, you have to, if you have private business interests in the town, you have to understand you may be restricted on whether you can represent those business interests before any town board. If you are a regular municipal employee, the conflict law restriction applies. But there is also a provision governing special municipal employees, and this applies to our unpaid board members predominantly. There is a provision in the law that says, look, we're the town, we have all of these paid positions, but we don't have an unlimited bank account, and yet we have all of these boards we need to staff. We need our citizens to engage with us, to serve on these boards and committees, but we can't pay them. Or to the extent we can, it's a stipend. In other words, by necessity, they're going to need private, private employment to support families and what have you. How do we get them to do that and also serve on our boards if we then tell them, once you serve on this board, you can't engage in any of your private business activities in the town? It is not workable. Nobody would agree to serve on any town boards. There's a provision in the conflict law that says the town can designate certain of its positions as special municipal employee positions. Any position that is unpaid, or to the extent it's paid, it's for less than 800 hours in a year. Or by the nature of the service provided to the town, it allows for private employment during normal business hours. Those positions are eligible to be designated by the town, usually through the Board of Selectmen, as special municipal employees. If you hold a position that has been so designated, the conflict law duty of loyalty requirement applies less restrictively. It basically says if you serve on a board where the board members have been designated as specials, you can continue to represent your business or other third-party interests before any department or board of the town except the one you serve on. That's a flexibility within the law.
So can that be done for a specific member of a board?
No, it's a position, by position. So if you have a Board of Health and you have 5 members of the Board of Health, the Board of Selectmen would designate Board of Health positions as specials. They can't say position 1 or 2 or 3 or 4.
Two questions. One is, we're right under the 10,000 now, so if we have
Right.
a board that's a special municipal employees, next census 2020, we're over 10,000, does that mean they lose that protection?
Okay, so the gentleman's question is, the population of the town is just under 10,000. How does that apply to special municipal employee positions? Well, it only applies to the Board of Selectmen. What the law says is that the positions who meet the criteria can be designated by the board as special municipal employee positions. Can the selectmen designate themselves? No, because that would be participating in a matter that could affect their financial interests if they're business people in the town and they have business interests with the town. But what the law says to work around having the selectmen having to wrestle with that, it says if the town population is less than 10,000, By statute, not by designation, but by statute, members of the Board of Selectmen are special municipal employees. If the population of the town is more than 10,000, members of the board are not special.
So as of 2020, the selectmen would not be special.
That's right.
And in fact, if the selectmen today designate the zoning board, let's say, as special municipal employees, as of 2020, they lose that designation?
No, those positions that can be designated by the Board of Selectmen, they remain unless the selectmen undesignate them, or if for some reason, some other factor means the positions no longer qualify. So
Okay.
for example, if you have an animal control officer that's part-time, they work 1 day a week, their position is eligible to be designated as a special municipal employee position, so the person could serve in more than one town position. What happens if the town then makes that a full-time position? Well, that position would no longer qualify as a special municipal employee position.
But, so then, another question, interesting one. Let's say that I'm an attorney, and I'm on some commission that has nothing to do with permitting or whatever, the Feel Better About Southborough committee or something, and I'm hired by a resident to represent them in front of the zoning board. That strikes me, based on what you've said here, is not permitted. Is that correct?
It depends. If the Feel Good Committee is in fact a town committee,
Yeah.
and they're not designated as specials,
Correct.
you are correct.
Okay.
But understand that sometimes it depends on the formation of a town committee. You just can't willy-nilly create a committee and have it be a town
Right, I'm
committee.
saying, a real town committee that's not involved.
Where they
in
have
zoning.
work product, they have to
Yeah,
comply
yeah,
with open
yeah,
meeting law.
Yeah, totally, a fully.
So for the sake of your example,
Yeah.
it is a town board.
Yeah.
Absolutely right. If those board members have not been designated by the selectmen as special municipal employees, and you are a board member, you cannot represent a client before the zoning board.
Or any other permit.
Or any other.
Any other board.
That's right.
Let's say that I'm an attorney and I'm a partner in a law firm, and because of the partnership structure, I share in the profits of the enterprise as a whole. My colleagues in the law firm represent clients in front of town boards.
Right.
So in fact, if they do that effectively, they get more fees and my income increases. Is that
Right.
a violation also?
Not a violation per se. Could it be? Yes. If your partners represent clients before your board, you would be required to abstain because your participation, if you were participating in a matter that affected your firm's financial interest, not the client's financial interest. In other words, when a client engages a firm to represent the interest, the fee is going to be what the fee is, whether the client gets the permit or not. So a matter affecting the client where the law firm represents the client is not necessarily a matter that affects the law firm's financial interest. It could, but not in all situations. But as the board member, exercising the best judgment possible, you would stay out of those matters. Our Ethics Commission members, they're retired judges, they're partners in prominent firms, and we cannot get through a monthly commission meeting without one or more of the members abstaining from matters because either they or their firm are acquainted with the parties we deal with.
Let's say that I'm an attorney on a board in town, and my firm represents several of the major real estate developers in town who appear before boards all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Does that create a conflict for me, again, as someone who's going to benefit financially
Sure.
from more fees from those folks?
It always creates a conflict. The question is it a financial interest conflict, or is it an appearance of a conflict? Or is it an improper use of position conflict? In other words, you sit on the board, this developer is before the board, it's represented by your firm, and you are the attorney from the firm that represents the developer, you would probably be required to stay out of that matter. But if it's a partner in your firm representing the developer, you cannot use your position in any way, shape, or form to secure an unwarranted privilege. In other words, to the extent they get a permit, they have to otherwise be entitled to it.
Doesn't that create the appearance of conflict?
Well, at a minimum, it's an appearance of a conflict. So at a minimum, if you participate, you will have to have a disclosure in place beforehand. If it's a matter that affects your financial interests or the financial interests of your firm, it's a nepotism situation, you have to stay out of that matter. But there's also, I think the main point of what's being said is the conflict law just doesn't apply one way. There are many ways it can apply, and in this situation, there are three that we've articulated. So, okay. So we talked about special municipal employees and the divided loyalty. There are exceptions to the rule, and that's what I want to point out. Municipal employees, you can pull certain permits without violating the duty of loyalty requirement. Say you're a firefighter and you work 24 on and 48 off, something like that. A lot of times those folks are also contractors. Now, how can they pull permits for property owners to do work in the same town where they might be a firefighter? Well, there's a carve out in the law that says a municipal employee, although we have these duty of loyalty requirements, municipal employees can pull certain permits, building, wiring, gas, plumbing, septic, without violating the conflict law, as long as in their public position, they have no responsibility for issuing the permits. They don't work for inspectional services, or they're not on the Board of Selectmen, which oversees inspectional services. That's a carve out. Also, disciplinary or personnel issues. The duty of loyalty requirement is imposed except an exception or exemption applies to personnel or disciplinary issues. You can act on someone else's behalf without violating the conflict law as long as you're not paid. You can represent your family members before town boards or departments, but your appointing authority has to approve of you doing so first. So where the duty of loyalty requirement is there, there are exceptions as identified here. The second provision of the law deals with contracts. The conflict law says this: municipal employee, you may not have a financial interest in another municipal contract. The premise under the conflict law is that municipal employees or state employees or county employees cannot use their positions to gain an inside track on additional compensation. So to the extent you're a department head and you control jobs or contracts, you can't hoard those to benefit yourself, your friends, your family. They have to be made available to everyone on an open, fair basis. The conflict law says municipal employees are prohibited from having a financial interest in another municipal contract. That applies to your ability to hold more than one municipal position, your ability to be a municipal employee, and also work privately on a vendor contract. But the law just contains that broad language, which sort of encompasses this inside track issue and then everything else. This section of the law that applies to us off the job has many regulations and exemptions that allow us to do things. And this is one of the most confusing sections of the conflict law, along with the duty of loyalty requirement. For example, the law says if you're a municipal employee, you can't hold a second municipal position or you can't work on a vendor contract. But if you are a special municipal employee, you can, as long as it doesn't involve the department or board that you serve as a town employee. There are also, and there's an exemption here that also says, let me see what we have here. If you're a municipal employee, you can serve on the Board of Selectmen. Any municipal employee can also serve on the Board of Selectmen without violating the conflict law, but you have to observe 3 conditions if you're serving in that dual capacity. I can be a full-time firefighter and also serve on the Board of Selectmen, but once I'm serving on the board, I can only take one pay to deal with the inside track issue. So the question becomes, do I want to continue to receive my firefighter salary, or would I like to forego that and instead take the stipend that they pay the selectmen? But I have to make that choice because I can only take one. The second condition is, while I'm acting with my Board of Selectmen hat, I have to stay out of matters within the purview of the fire department. The third condition is I'm ineligible for any other appointment while I serve on the Board of Selectmen and for 6 months after I leave the board. You know what that means? If I'm a firefighter and I'm also serving on the board, and a civil service promotional opportunity to fire captain comes up, and I've got the years of service in, and I take the test and I get the highest grade, I can't be appointed. Not while I'm serving on the Board of Selectmen. Ineligible for appointment to any other position. If you're elected and paid, you can hold any number of elected positions, because holding an elected position is sort of a 24/7 situation. You're not required to keep office hours. You're not required to do anything. You're allowed to campaign at any time of the day, whereas if you're an appointed employee, you can't be involved in campaign or political activity at work using public resources, such as in public buildings, on public time, or using public equipment and supplies. If you're elected, it's a different situation. You can hold any number of elected positions. You can also be a paid appointed employee and hold an unpaid position. Why is that an issue under the conflict law? Because if you're appointed to an unpaid position and you also hold a paid appointed position, you're a municipal employee in both capacities. So in your paid position, you don't have a financial interest in an unpaid position, but guess what? As an unpaid employee, you have a financial interest in the paid position. But there's a carve-out that says, through a regulation, an appointed paid employee can hold an unpaid position, provided that they file a disclosure with their appointing authority in the paid position that they're holding the other position. And then for towns with less than 3,500 doesn't apply to us. The last section of the law, what happens when you leave town service? Even after you leave public service, the conflict law can still apply to you. How? The context is you leave public service, you now want to represent third party or private business interests before the town, before that board or department you just left. Can you do it? The answer to that exciting question is it depends on the circumstances. Not all circumstances are prohibited by the conflict law. The conflict law restricts those situations that you worked on while you were a town employee. If your fingerprints are on it, the law would restrict you from leaving town service and then representing a client or a new employer before the department you left in connection with those matters that contain your fingerprints. A permanent restriction applies if you worked on the matter as a town employee. And that's the context. You're a town employee, you leave town service, you now want to represent some third-party interest before the town, before either the department or the board that you served on. The second issue is matters that you didn't work on, but they were under your official responsibility. Such as if you're a department head, everything that comes into your department while you're a department head is a matter under your official responsibility, but you don't work on all of those matters. Staff does what staff does, you deal with what you deal with. You can distinguish between matters that you handled versus matters that you did not handle, but they were nonetheless under your official responsibility. As to matters that you handle, permanent restriction applies in terms of your ability to leave town employment and then represent a private business interest before the town in connection with those matters. As to matters that you didn't handle but they were under your official responsibility, the law imposes a 1-year cooling off period. You have to wait 1 year after leaving town service before you can represent that third-party interest before the town. Why 1 year? Because when you leave town employment or town service, you still know people. You still have an ability to leverage stuff, to leverage those relationships. The law requires a 1-year cooling off period, so that sort of attenuates a little bit. If you're a partner in a firm and you leave town service, your partners may also be restricted in whether they can represent a client. If it's a matter that you have a permanent restriction and you're a partner in a firm, you can't represent the client before the town because you worked on that matter as a town employee. Your partners have a 1-year restriction imposed on them so that they cannot leverage your relationships with that town department or board. If you have a 1-year cooling off period imposed on you, your partners will not have any restriction imposed on them. Okay, if you are a board member, say you're on the Board of Health and the Board of Health appoints the health agent and the health agent leaves. Can you serve as the health agent? Under the conflict law, you cannot be a board member and also be appointed to a paid position that is appointed by that board. Can you serve in that paid position? Yes, but you have to resign the board position and wait 30 days and you can then be appointed to the position. Your fellow board members, if say it's the Board of Health and health agent and the Board of Health appoints to the health agent, you resign from the Board of Health can consider applications including yours, but they cannot appoint you until you have been off the board for 30 days. So you're restricted. Now, can you serve on a town board and also serve in an appointed position? Yeah, as long as there's no overlap there. And if the board position has been designated as a special municipal employee, you can also hold an appointed paid position, but you have to file a disclosure with the town clerk, not your appointing authority. The disclosure is with the town clerk that you are a special municipal employee who also is holding a paid town position. Hopefully that confuses you, so that if the situation resonates again, you call our office so that we can help sort these things out. And in most situations, we don't take enforcement action. If we learn that a town employee is holding more than one position, but the conflict law allows it, if a position has been designated and a disclosure has been filed, but the person didn't do one or both, if we can get somebody into compliance, that's what we do. We resolve matters confidentially, we get people into compliance, and then everything's okay. But in situations where they cannot get into compliance, those are the situations where we might take enforcement action. We had a situation where he was a lieutenant and also serving on the Board of Selectmen, and then the town wanted to create a deputy chief's position, to create a layer between the chief and the managers and the patrol force, created a deputy chief's position, and this person, who was also serving on the Board of Selectmen, was appointed, got that promotion. And then we learned about it. He was required to give up that position, had to pay a fine for violating the conflict law in a significant way, because it was something that he should have known to contact us. In other words, before he took the position, he got advice from us, and we explained that. And then years later, the situation came up, he took the position. So he had to give up the position. The Board of Selectmen, he was the senior command rank officer. They wanted him for that position. So when he resigned that deputy chief position, he also resigned from the Board of Selectmen. The Board of Selectmen left that position unfilled for 6 months, and then they appointed him. The difference is, it was illegal to appoint him in this capacity. After he was off the board for 6 months, it was then legal, then the appointment was okay. Okay. Oh, damn, I never thought. So, this is the last slide. It is also the most important slide. When in doubt, don't. Hopefully you are confused so that you know when the red flag should go up, but then call our office. Again, we want to drive all questions about compliance under the law to our office. Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Sorry.
Back to one of your earlier comments in terms of the gift restrictions, and you said MassDOT has the no tolerance rule as port. Is that something that a local town could do with a bylaw, or are there towns that actually
Personnel
have that?
policy. Doesn't even have to be, it doesn't have the force of law, personnel policy.
So, but if, for example, a citizen group wanted to do something like that, could one have a citizen petition to amend the personnel
if they want a town meeting to,
policy?
And
Town meeting could approve by majority vote an amendment to the salary administration plan or the personnel policy.
They can do whatever, but again, I would recommend that if they want to impose that kind of a restriction where they can, make sure there's an enforcement mechanism that accompanies it, or else.
What would the enforcement mechanism look like?
Well, it would be that, say, a town employee, give me an example that.
Well, zero tolerance. So if somebody accepts a gift of $50 or whatever,
so it would,
what do you do?
It would be, by town policy,
them.
town employees may not accept any item of any value from anyone doing business with the town. The Board of Selectmen can take steps to enforce this provision, including disciplinary action up to and including termination. You have to have that language, and then you can do something. Or it could be the appointing authority, the manager.
And there are towns who have that kind of provision in their personnel policies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The mechanisms of it, however, are outside of our jurisdiction, so I couldn't otherwise comment on how to do it. Any other questions? Yes, Jim?
A question about special municipal employees.
Yes.
I had suggested to the selectmen a couple of months ago, they make it a priority to review which boards and committees in town are special municipal employees. Because it turned out, number one, frankly, we didn't know. And number two, there are committees, for example, members of advisory was at one time identified as special municipal employees. So where am I going with this? Doing some little research on this in other towns, I found across the state, some towns, seems almost everyone's a special municipal employee, and some is none.
Mm-hmm.
From your perspective, what have you seen?
Well, it runs the gamut, and I'll just, by way of context, the conflict law has been on the books since 1963. This provision allowing towns to designate certain of its employee positions has been on the books since that time. And over the years, it was the Attorney General before the Ethics Commission, and then the Ethics Commission, sending out information to the town saying this ability is available, please update your list of special municipal employees. And then through the process of information exchange and gathering, towns would look at what's in our best interest. And so if a town was having difficulty getting citizens to staff positions because people had business interests and restricted them, they might say, you know what, it's in the best interest of the town to designate. And some towns, they said, you know what, let us sort of just work our way through all that. Any position that we can designate, if it meets the criteria, we're going to do it. Other towns, it's been on a piecemeal basis. We've had situations in one town where political squabbles have occurred, and the ability of one board member to continue to serve was based on the position being designated as a special. This person and members of the Board of Selectmen were at odds all the time. So guess what the selectmen did? They revoked that special designation. So by default, that person had to leave the board. End of problem. So, you know, there's been the use for political ends. There's been the use for convenience for the town. And our recommendation is that when towns create special municipal employees, that they notify the Ethics Commission, because if we're looking at these sections of the law, potential violations involving the duty of loyalty or the multiple contracts issue, one of the first things we need to do for information gathering purposes is establish whether the particular position is a special. So we'll call the town clerk. But if the town has furnished us with that information already, we just go to our own records. We have loose leaf notebooks. We are resource challenged, so we don't have this stuff electronically stored. But if you were to call me tomorrow and say, can you give me what you have about our town's designations, I can scan that and send that to you, and that can be, you know, sort of the foundation for working through. You may want to look at that and say, well, these positions were eligible in 1963, but they're now full-time, so, you know, you might have, like your police department, they might have been all reserve officers and your chief was the only full-time position back, you know, 40 years ago. Things are different now. So you look at, okay, let's look at who are designated now, who do we want to leave in place, who do we want to reevaluate, and so forth. We will get to, in the coming months, maybe year, where we're going to actively work with all the towns, and we'll use Google Docs or something where we want to actively know each towns, all 351 cities and towns, who are your special municipal employees, and we want to maintain that database for your benefit and ours. It helps our research and so forth. So,
Follow on to that, this question for Jim. Who in Southborough are special municipal employees now? Do we have a list of that that's on the website someplace?
No, it's not on the website. I'll be happy to give it to you.
Just curious.
The interesting wrinkle is that it doesn't apply to an individual, it applies to a position.
Right.
And the second thing is it stays with that position until the selectmen revoke it.
Right.
or unless
Or
the
unless it changes.
position no longer qualifies.
Or if in 2020 we're over 10,000, does that get automatically revoked for boards
Well,
that
for
have
Board of
been previously
Selectmen, the
designated?
population only applies to members of the Board of Selectmen. So if in the next
okay.
census,
Okay.
you're over 10,000, Board of Selectmen members are no longer eligible to be special. So if you have a board member who owns an insurance company and writes policies for town insurance, guess what?
Yeah, he's up, but other boards aren't limited by the population.
That's right, that doesn't affect us.
So today, do we have lots of boards that have been designated, or almost none, or?
Advisory is one of the ones that caught my eye.
Interesting.
It didn't make a lot of sense. And that's what caused me to do the research to figure out,
Is that like your finance committee?
Yeah.
yes.
But understand that in most communities, finance committee members are special municipal employees because they're generally unpaid, they're appointed by the moderator, and so if the selectman designates them.
So as an advisory member, I can now do business with the town. Fantastic.
Well, it's one thing you should take away from this. Everything is comma, except.
Call. In other words, if the advisory committee has to make important decisions about funding a new school project,
Right.
can you in your private business capacity represent or work on that
Right.
on the private side? That's what you were going to call us about. Okay? Thank you for your patience. Sorry we ran over. I just get very verbose sometimes. But it was good questions, good discussion, and again,
Thank you very much.
if you have any questions, you give our office a call.